My name is Thea, and I'm 31 years old. 3 days before my wedding, I found out my parents had already bought plane tickets, not to my ceremony, but to Singapore, to send my brother off on a business trip. I read the text sitting on my bathroom floor, still in my wedding dress from the final fitting. My father didn't call. He didn't explain. He just added a thumbs up to my mother's message. So on the morning of my wedding, with no one to walk me down the aisle, I asked a near stranger to do it instead, a quiet man named Julian, a widower, a landscaper by Monday. That video had over 1 million views, and my father's boss was the one who recognized him first. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to the summer I turned 17, when my grandmother said something I didn't understand until the day I walked down that aisle alone. My grandmother's house smelled like clove and dish soap, and every window in it stuck a little in the frame, so you had to lift and push at the same time to get them open. I learned that trick when I was 9. I still remember the exact sound the wood made, a groan, then a soft pop, like something exhaling. Her name was Ines, and she was the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I was already enough. My mother's house was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Achievements were currency there, and I was born without much capital. My brother Desmond got the trophies on the mantle. He got the college fund that never seemed to run dry, no matter how many times he changed his major. I got a full scholarship to a state school I'd applied to and won on my own, filling out the forms at my grandmother's kitchen table under a lamp that buzzed if you touched the shade. My mother's response to that scholarship was to ask why I hadn't tried somewhere with better name recognition. My grandmother's response was different. She set down 2 mugs of chamomile tea, the ceramic warm enough that I had to hold mine with both hands, and she said, "They only value what they can show off, Thea. That's not the same thing as loving you." I didn't understand that sentence then. I filed it away the way you file away a coat you're not sure you'll need, folded at the back of a closet, waiting for weather you can't yet imagine. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner of her living room, and on cold nights she'd let me sit close enough to feel the heat on my shins while she darned socks that didn't really need darning, just for the excuse to have something to do with her hands while we talked. She had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like tests. "What did you notice today?" she'd ask, instead of, "What did you accomplish?" Nobody else in my life asked me that question. Nobody else cared what I noticed. There were 3 memories from that house I've never let go of. The first, my grandmother teaching me to press flowers between the pages of an old dictionary, the paper going thin and brown at the edges, my fingers smelling like crushed violets for the rest of the day. The second, a Sunday dinner where my mother announced mid-meal that Desmond had been accepted to a leadership program, unremarkable, in hindsight, one of a dozen things he was accepted into that year, and my grandmother caught my eye across the table and gave the smallest shake of her head, like she was telling me, "Don't compete for this. It isn't a contest worth winning." The third memory is quieter than the others. It was raining, the kind of gray November rain that turns the whole afternoon the color of an old photograph, and my grandmother was going through a drawer of papers at her roll-top desk. She caught me watching and closed the drawer, gently, the way you'd close a door on a sleeping child. "Not yet," she said. "But someday, this will matter more than you think." I didn't ask what this was. I was 14, and there were flowers to press, and the rain was making that specific sound against her tin roof, a sound I can still hear if I close my eyes. By the time I was 17, I understood one thing clearly, even if I couldn't have said it in words yet. My grandmother's house was where I was safe, and my parents' house was where I performed. The distance between those 2 truths would take me years to fully measure. My grandmother died the winter I turned 23. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late to do anything but manage the pain. I flew home for the last 6 weeks and slept in the guest room down the hall from hers, waking at odd hours to check on her, learning the particular quiet of a house where everyone is waiting for something they don't want to happen. My mother cried at the funeral. I don't doubt the tears were real. But less than 2 weeks later, I overheard her on the phone with my father, in the kitchen, using a voice I didn't recognize. Flat, efficient, the voice of someone reading a grocery list. "The house needs to go on the market before spring," she said, "and we should talk to someone about the estate before Thea gets any ideas." Ideas. That was the word she used, not grief, not memory. Ideas. As if my love for my grandmother was a liability to be managed. I stood in the hallway with a box of my grandmother's kitchen towels in my arms and said nothing. I didn't confront her. I didn't cry where she could see me. I went back to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and understood, really understood, for the first time, that I had become invisible to my own parents. Not invisible in the sense that they didn't see me, invisible in the sense that they didn't think I was watching. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. Estate ideas, logistics. I started doing small things after that. I kept a folder, quietly, without telling anyone, of photos from that house. Dates written on the back in my grandmother's handwriting, which I'd found in a shoebox nobody else had bothered to open. I called the plumber when the pipes froze that January and paid the bill myself and told no one I wasn't protecting an inheritance. I didn't think there was one I was protecting. The only proof I had that someone in my family had once looked at me and meant it. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with any of this. I only knew that I would need it someday, the way you keep a spare key you've never had to use. 6 months after the funeral, my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, between talking about Desmond's new apartment, that my grandmother's lawyer had reached out about some paperwork. She said it the way you'd mention a dentist appointment. I said I'd take care of it, if she wanted. She waved a hand. "If you want to deal with all that, be my guest." She had no idea what she'd just handed me. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. His name was Aldous Grieve, and he'd represented my grandmother for over 20 years. He greeted me like he'd been expecting me for a while, because, as it turned out, he had. "Your grandmother came to see me 4 years before she passed," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "She was very specific about how this was to be handled, and very specific that it should wait until you came to me, not the other way around." Inside the folder was a letter, handwritten, the same handwriting from the backs of those photographs. She'd left me the house. Not split between me and Desmond and my parents, as everyone had assumed, without ever asking. Hers alone, left to me alone, along with a modest but real trust that had been quietly growing since before I was born. They only value what they can show off. She'd written at the bottom of the letter, "This isn't about money, Thea. It's about someone finally choosing you first. I'm sorry it had to be me, and not them." I sat with that letter for a long time before I said anything. Aldous let me, he'd clearly done this before. Sat across from someone, processing 20 years of love they hadn't known they'd received. He explained, gently, that my parents had already been quietly probing him about next steps for the estate, assuming there would be something to divide. He'd told them nothing. Per my grandmother's instructions, he'd been waiting for me. I learned, over the following weeks, exactly how the story was going to end before my parents even knew it had a second act. My mother had already mentioned the house to a realtor friend, just to get a sense of the market. My father had floated the idea of Desmond taking the guest cottage on the property, since he'd need somewhere after Singapore. They were dividing a house that had never been theirs to divide, 3 weeks before my wedding, without once asking whether I might have feelings about any of it. I texted Aldous 2 words after our final meeting that month. "I'm ready." That night, I lay in bed listening to my parents' house settle around me, the pipes ticking, the refrigerator humming, and I thought about how they were falling asleep certain they'd already won something. They had no idea the game had ended 4 years earlier, in a lawyer's office they didn't know existed. Aldous walked me through it in plain language, the kind my grandmother would have approved of. The house and trust were already legally mine. Nothing to fight for, nothing to contest. so long as I signed the final transfer acknowledgement and filed the paperwork releasing the estate from probate. It was a formality, really. The real inheritance had already happened. This was just making it official on paper. 2 nights before the wedding, my mother tried a different approach. She showed up at my apartment with a bag of my favorite pastries from the bakery near my old high school. A gesture so specifically, calculatedly nostalgic, that I almost laughed. "I know things have been tense," she said, setting the bag down like a peace offering, "but we're family. Families don't need to make everything so complicated."
She meant the house. She meant Desmond's flight, which she hadn't yet mentioned canceling. She meant, underneath all of it, don't make this harder for us. "I'll think about it," I said. I didn't tell her about Aldous. I didn't tell her about the letter. I never tip my hand before I'm ready. My younger cousin Ren, 16 and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, pulled me aside at a family lunch that same week. "Aunt Meredith keeps talking about Desmond's trip like it's more important than your wedding," she said, quietly, like she was handing me something fragile. "Is that true?" I told her it was. She didn't say anything else. She just squeezed my hand under the table, and I understood that even the youngest people in this family could see what my parents pretended not to. That night, alone, I drove out to my grandmother's house, my house now, though the papers weren't final, and sat on the back porch steps in the cold. The window still stuck in its frame. I lifted and pushed, the way she'd taught me, and it opened with that same groaning pop, and for a moment it was like she was still in the kitchen behind me. I almost called my mother right then. I almost begged her to just show up, to just choose me once, so I wouldn't have to do any of this the hard way. But I remembered the drawer she'd closed so gently when I was 14. "Not yet, but someday, this will matter more than you think." I wish this were different. I wish my mother had been the kind of woman who would have chosen my wedding over an airport goodbye, instead of calculating which one photographed better for her friends. I wish my father had been the kind of man who kept a promise he made a year in advance. But wishes don't hold up under pressure. The truth does. I cried on that porch, not because I was breaking, because for the first time, I could finally see the whole shape of what had happened to me, clearly, without flinching away from it. I sat there until the cold got into my hands, and then I locked up the house the way she'd taught me, checked the back door twice, the window latch last, and drove home in the dark with the radio off, letting the quiet do what it needed to do. It was 11:50 p.m. the night before my wedding when Aldous called, as promised, to walk me through the final signature over video. My apartment was silent. Rowan was asleep in the next room, exhausted from carrying centerpieces up 3 flights of stairs all afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the only light in the apartment, and Aldous appeared on screen in a cardigan, looking like a man who'd signed 1,000 of these documents and still took each one seriously. "Once you sign this," he said, "the house, the trust, all of it, is formally and irrevocably yours. Your grandmother made sure of that 4 years ago tonight. You're just making it official." I signed. "For what it's worth," Aldous said, before we hung up, "she talked about you more than she ever let on. She was proud of you long before any of this." 12:03 a.m. I am 31. I am, as of that signature, the sole owner of the only home that ever felt like mine. And across town, my parents were asleep, packed and ready for a 5 a.m. flight to Singapore, certain they'd made the smarter choice. They'll find out exactly how wrong they were in about 11 hours. Julian said yes without hesitation when Odalise asked. "Family isn't only blood," he told me. I'd be honored. I walked down that aisle smiling, a real smile, not the one brides are trained to hold for cameras, because for the first time in years, everyone around me had chosen to be there. My best friend filmed it. By Monday, it had crossed 1 million views. My mother called 61 times that day. The final voicemail was the one that mattered. My father's boss, Gerald Wickham, had seen the video and recognized Julian immediately, not as a stranger, but as the founder of Thorn Horticultural Group, the man who'd personally signed the contract renewal tied to my father's company months earlier.
Gerald called my father in Monday morning and asked, point blank, why one of the company's most valuable partners had been standing in for him at his own daughter's wedding. My father stammered something about a family emergency. Gerald didn't believe him, and he said so. He looked at my father like he was still the reliable man he'd hired 11 years earlier. He wasn't. He hadn't been for a long time. My father had simply never been asked to prove it before. My mother wanted me to post something clarifying it was all a misunderstanding. I let 4 days of calls go to voicemail on my honeymoon. When I finally called her back, I told her plainly, choosing Desmond's flight wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. And decisions have consequences, whether or not the internet happens to notice them. My grandmother used to say, they only value what they can show off. That's not the same thing as loving you. I always thought she meant my parents were shallow. What she really meant was that I would need to build my own definition of family from people who chose me without needing an audience to perform it for. My father was quietly passed over for the promotion he'd wanted for over a year. My mother still calls sometimes, though less often now. Julian became something between a friend and the father figure I'd never had. He lost his own daughter 6 years before we met, and I think walking me down that aisle gave him back something he thought was gone for good. My brother Desmond reached out months later, sick to his stomach when he learned our parents had used his trip as their excuse. We're rebuilding something now, slowly, that doesn't require either of us to compete for scraps. As for me, I still have the house. The window in the kitchen still sticks, and I still lift and push at the same time to open it, and it still makes that same groaning, exhaling sound. I think about my grandmother every time I do it, and I think, some people spend their whole lives trying to earn love from people who are never going to give it freely. I'm just grateful I finally stopped being one of them. If you've ever had to build your own version of family out of the people who actually showed up, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments, and if this one moved you, subscribe to Dad's Revenge Tales. There are more like it still to come.